everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on this lovely evening. My name is Zachi, and I am a part of the MYD Capacity Building Working Group, and I'll be the moderator for the session. So before we kick off with the session, I'm just going to briefly talk about the importance of climate action and also the impacts of climate change. So the reason why it is so important for us to take climate action is because climate change is not a standalone event, where it's not a certain part of the world that will be affected and the rest part of the world can save themselves from it. So there will be several sectors that will be severely impacted if we allow climate change to progress at its own pace. So those sections namely are food security, habitat, as well as public health. So these three sectors are basically our basic necessities, and if we allow these sectors to be affected, then our everyday life will be affected as well. And hence, that will cause the economy to crumble. And with the economy crumbling, that would impact the global community at a very severe rate. So the importance of climate action is to minimize the loss and damages. So some of you might be familiar with the Paris Agreement, which is a most recent international framework on climate change, and it is a part of the UNFCCC. So the Paris Agreement goal is to ensure that the global temperature rise does not exceed 2 degrees Celsius. And that is because if we allow the global temperature rise to exceed beyond 2 degrees Celsius, there will be severe climate impacts, which namely first loss of species that has been happening throughout centuries, I would say, but now it's progressing even more rapid because climate change is picking up its pace and yet we are not. And moving on, there will be extreme weathers. I'm sure some of you have seen severe rain or perhaps flash floods that's happening in Malaysia, and the same things or even worse things are happening to other countries all across the globe, and that is because of climate change. Now, with the temperature rising as well as extreme weathers, we also have problems with the rise of water level, as the ice in the Arctic will be melting if our global temperature does not stop rising. And that will affect our water availability. And in that case, with the rise of sea level, water availability, extreme weather, then certain parts of the world will no longer be habitable, and there will be climate migrants. For instance, in Malaysia, every day it's getting hotter and hotter. And one day, with the weather being not habitable anymore, all of us will have to be climate migrants and move to a certain part of the world that can accommodate and also give us a habitable surrounding. So with all this pollution, extreme weather going on, there will be severe health implications upon humans. And last but not least, with the extreme weathers, there will be certain crops that can no longer grow, and thus that will threaten our food security. So climate change essentially is a very big cycle, and that is what we have to break. So that's basically about the general part of climate impacts. Now, moving forward, I would just like to briefly introduce MYD, Malaysian Youth Delegation. And we are a Malaysian civil society organization made up of young, passionate Malaysians, and MYD plays a representing role in Malaysia's local youth climate movement, and we intend to raise awareness of climate policies among Malaysians. MYD holds speaking engagements with various climate organizations to better understand the climate landscape of local and international climate policies. So currently the solutions we're providing are to instill awareness and to motivate people to take action. Although we may not have any initiatives in regards to these solutions at the moment, as we are all still learning, we want to gather insights from vast backgrounds of participants, such as yourselves, that IGM brings. And through these insights, we hope to identify the most promising method and potentially get the ball rolling for the right initiatives in the near future. So before we proceed to the main part of our session, I think it is vital for our audience to understand the concept of climate finance. And the 3 key international environmental conventions are the United Nations Convention, So the 3 key international environmental conventions are first, the United Nations Convention on Combating Desertification, UNCCD, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, and last but not least, United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity, otherwise known as UNCBD. So, as mentioned before, the Paris Agreement is currently the focal point of climate issues that was established through the UNFCCC. And climate finance has been incorporated within the Paris Agreement as well as the UNFCCC. So what exactly is climate finance that I've been rambling on for so long? It refers to local, national, or transnational financing drawn from public, private, and alternative sources of financing that addresses climate change. The Convention, the Kyoto Protocol, which is the predecessor of Paris Agreement, as well as Paris Agreement, calls for financial assistance from parties with more financial resources to those that are lacking in resources. And this is very much in accordance with the principle of common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities set out in the UNFCCC, whereby developed country parties are to provide financial resources to assist developing country parties in implementing the objectives of the UNFCCC. And as we all know, Malaysia is a signatory towards the Paris Agreement, and Malaysia's pledge towards the Paris Agreement is to reduce carbon emission by 45%. And in that 45%, 10% is being conditional upon the receipt of assistance from the developed countries, and that is precisely what we're here to discuss today. And these assistance are given through the sectors of climate financing, technology transfer, and capacity building. But today, we're focusing on climate finance. So on the part of receiving assistance on climate financing, in 2017, the Green Climate Fund, one of the climate funds established by the UNFCCC, has channeled funding to Malaysia through a collaboration with the Carbon Trust. And this project includes work in the distinct area of the energy sector and low carbon cities. Through these avenues of assistance, the past and the future, one can envision the prospects of Malaysia's climate scene in a very hopeful light. So our session today is aimed to introduce the concept of climate finance and its application in Malaysia. So this session will consist of 3 short and comprehensive presentations on subtopics related to climate finance, and all pitches will be considered in the context of Malaysia with the possibility of ASEAN collaborations. Ultimately, we mean to encourage action and stir inspiration. Before we proceed, I would like to remind everyone that there will be a question and answer session after all the presentations. So please keep your answers, my apologies. Please keep your questions until then, and they will be addressed by the speakers later on. Now, moving on to our speakers for today. First up, we have Ms. Farhana, and Ms. Farhana is an MSc by Research candidate on crop insurance, and she has presented at conferences in Malaysia and Romania on the development of rural communities through crop insurance. With a background in risk management, she spends her free time learning about climate crisis and its effect on different sectors. Now, Ms. Farhana, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ziji. Assalamualaikum and good evening. Thank you for joining this session. My name is Farhana and I am from the Malaysian Youth Delegation for Climate Change. My intention for the presentation today is to convince you, the audience, that climate finance is smart risk management. So let's begin. Simply put, risk is defined as an uncertain future event or the possibility of something bad happening. If you really think about it, the meaning of risk can range from uncertainty to loss to even opportunity. Despite its traditionally negative connotation, risk has a positive connotation as well, which we will get to later on. The risk of climate change is very much real, and unfortunately, we are experiencing it. Some examples of severe climate change are the 2014-2015 flood in Malaysia that caused over 200,000 people to be displaced. Another one, and quite recently, the Australian bushfires, which accounted for over 18 million hectares of land. And lastly, damaged or lost crop and livestock in Asia, mainly due to drought. These are just some of what's happened, and we will continue to experience at much severe degrees. Hence, this makes us more obligated to understand the climate risk and to do something about it, and in this case, practicing climate finance. If we look at climate change in a broad sense, the impact, loss, and damage due to climate change, direct and indirect, can be problematic, mostly because it is too extensive. To put this into perspective, if we take the crop failure as an example, climate change affects crop production. That affects food supply, which can lead to food insecurity and even livelihoods. Many of the communities who would be most affected by the shortage of food, like the rural communities, would depend on farming as a means of income. Another indirect effect would be restricted access to healthy diet, which affects people's health. Now let's take a step further. Crop failure due to climate change would also impact the country and the government. Not only do they have to financially compensate those affected through government aid, it would affect economic growth because agriculture does account for about a third of global GDP. And for countries who are dependent on agricultural export, they will lose out financially and may resort to loans, which is a long term commitment, furthering their financial burden. So, you see, addressing one risk is not just tackling one problem, it is addressing the right risk, which will ideally address both direct and indirect consequences. Using the example from earlier, if climate risk is certain, it can be planned and managed properly. To name a few, such as practicing hydroponic farming in both rural and urban areas to ensure food production. Another is to diversify crop plantation to mitigate the effects of changing climate as some crops adapt better than others, and implementing crop insurance to provide a financial cushion to crop producers. If climate risk is uncertain, it becomes an important problem because addressing the wrong issue would not only prove inefficient, it would also make the situation worse. For instance, the practicing of carbon trading. This practice doesn't necessarily encourage emissions reductions. Rather, it allows for carbon emission heavy industries to continue profit from pollution while by exchanging their right to emit CO2. There is a burden to climate risk whether we address it or not. In general, the response to risk is either to avoid it, in this case I don't see how, or to reduce the negative consequences. Climate risk and its potential losses create significant economic burdens at all levels, be it government, businesses, and individuals. When the risk is certain, as I mentioned earlier, the risk can be properly planned and managed. Billions are spent each year to finance potential losses through mitigation and adaptation efforts. When it isn't planned, the cost may be more. Without the ability to properly address climate risk, it may deprive society of services judged to be too risky or unnecessary. Just as how climate risk pose a threat to us, there are good things that come from it. For starters, and the most obvious, climate finance is applied, even normalized. The application of climate finance facilitates the development and implementation of sustainable projects, be it mitigation efforts such as renewable energy or adaptation efforts like urban farming. While availability of capital for sustainable projects, there is no restriction for anyone from any walks of life to come up with and make happen an idea that could benefit the wider public in dealing with climate change. One such innovation is the flood park in Bangkok, Thailand. Bangkok is an urban area with a mostly flat landscape, making flood in the urban area easy. The park, designed with an incline, directs the water away from the city and into the park, where the water is used. From this, new specializations arise that were not known or needed before, such as green design professionals, which include architects, landscape designers, even urban planners involved in efforts to green the spaces we live in and work in. From all this, it brings everyone together because everyone is vulnerable to climate risk. We have a stronger reason to work together than not. As the saying goes, alone we can do so little, together we can do so much. Climate finance is a social responsibility. It allows for personal agency on how to respond to climate change and be part of the solution. It is important for us to realize that just as how we are part of the problem, we too have a piece of the solution. And if we can admit that to ourselves, we start to find others who are also interested in being part of the solution. With the increase in awareness and initiation, new platforms are created to facilitate the transition to an inclusive green economy. In the realm of climate finance, for instance, there is, for starters, the Green Finance Platform, which is a platform that brings together experts and organizations to address major knowledge gaps in sustainable finance. In Asia Pacific, there is the Financial Centers for Sustainability, also known as FC4S, which promotes the innovation and development of sustainable and green finance. In Malaysia, there is the Malaysian Green Technology Corporation, which has departments dedicated to green finance. Risk management is identifying a risk in advance, analyzing it as to take precautionary steps in curbing the risk. In that alone explains part of the process of risk management. As, as previously discussed, climate risk is a certainty and its effects are damaging and will continue to increase. Climate finance can and should be a risk management tool as it can aid and be part of a systematic response. Climate finance is the financing of mitigation and adaptation efforts, and by having these efforts in place, it can reduce or spread out climate impact or both. Climate finance can be practiced at all levels and benefit everyone, though the responsibility of climate finance do not solely fall on the shoulders of government or monetary institutions. It would help in setting an example. Back in 2017, when HSBC UK pension scheme decided to change the default investment option to a sustainability focused fund, they reached out to some of the companies they invest in to ask them how their business is transitioning to be consistent with the sustainable world. After a year of engagement, if these companies do not make enough progress, they are removed from the fund. This is a positive step and gives incentives for the commercial sector to transition to a sustainable economy. Also, this practice has attracted young professionals into traditional sectors like investment and pensions. This attracts more talent and the ability to include new perspectives to a traditional profession, paving the way forward to a sustainable future. All in all, climate risk is a certain risk, and though climate finance may not be the solution, it is part of the solution. Therefore, climate finance is smart risk management. Thank you.
Thank you, Farhana. I believe, yes, that's correct. We need to start by admitting that we are part of the problem and we can be part of the solution. Now, moving on, we have our next speaker, who is Ms. Chu Ai Hui. So Ms. Chu Ai Hui is an economics graduate with a growing passion for sustainable finance. Currently, she's an analyst with an international financial service firm. With a background in capital markets, she spends her spare time learning about how governments and corporates from various industries utilize financial instruments towards sustainable growth. The floor is yours, Ms. Valerie.
Thank you, Zuchi. Hi, everyone. I'm Ivy. Thank you for tuning in. I represent Malaysian Youth Delegation, specifically from the Policy and Research Working Group. For this session, I will be sharing with you an idea that will hopefully inspire higher mobilization of private finance in support of the low carbon transition. Now, before I dive into the idea, allow me to give some context, especially to those who are unfamiliar with private finance or the investment landscape. So in this slide, I've illustrated a simplified snapshot of how the investment chain works in practice. This diagram will also provide you the various roles of private and public sector institutions and how capital flows within the financial system. Let's walk through this in interaction of the private sector, public sector, and the real economy together. From the top of the slide, you can notice that you have two groups of economic players known as asset owners and asset managers. So this is where the main source of the funds would flow from. And through various financial instruments such as bonds and shares, the funds eventually flow through to the corporations, and these funds will be used to purchase or operate assets in the real economy. Moving on to the next slide, I would like to highlight that an interest in sustainable investing has gained traction in the investments industry all around the world. But efforts have been hindered by several factors. Here on this slide, I have outlined 5 main barriers, not arranged in any sequence of priority. These barriers need to be overcome through partnerships across the public and private sectors. Challenge number 1. Proven investment models are not replicated at scale. Despite progress in clean energy investment, investor appetite for clean energy projects often exceeds the volume of investment opportunities. Moreover, development of new coal-fired power plants continues even in markets where low carbon alternatives are already cost competitive, particularly in emerging markets with rapidly growing power demand. Challenge number 2. Risks in emerging markets constrain low carbon investments. The lack of investment is due to several factors, including country and project specific risks. A lack of policies and regulations to support clean energy markets, underdeveloped local capital markets, and the absence of experienced project developers and value chains. Challenge number 3. Many low carbon investments in key emitting sectors are not yet profitable. There are few viable alternatives exist in many sectors with a significant share of global emissions. These sectors include heavy industry, heavy-duty transport, agriculture, forestry, and land use. In some cases, solutions for decarbonizing these sectors are technically viable, but not yet economically, due to high capital costs and lack of incentives or revenue models. In other cases, the necessary technologies require further development to reach commercialization. Challenge number 4. The transition away from carbon-intensive business models may create financial and social risks. Many assets in the real economy are long-lived, ranging from around 15 years for cars and buses, up to 50 years for fossil fuels power plants, and you could say up to 100 years or more for buildings. Consequently, the financing decisions of the past can lock in carbon emissions well into the future. In order to remain compatible with a 1.5 degree Celsius trajectory, some carbon-intensive assets will likely need to be retired early, hence requiring a transformation of the corporations, utilities, and communities that have historically relied on their operations. Challenge number 5. A lack of tools and incentives to align financial portfolios with a low carbon future. There is currently a lack of climate-related information and standardized methodologies that facilitate the integration of climate-related risks and opportunities into investment decisions. So the idea that I will be presenting at the end of my session relates to this last challenge. Now let's move on to the next slide. So there are numerous efforts towards standardization of company disclosure related to climate risks, such as TCFD or SASB. So TCFD stands for Task Force on Climate-Related Finance Disclosure, while SASB stands for Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. However, for my session, I would like to focus on Principle for Responsible Investment, also known as PRI. You will understand why I decided to focus on this in my next slide, but before we go into why, allow me to introduce what PRI is. So PRI is an investor initiative in partnership with United Nations Environment Programme Finance Initiative and the United Nations Global Compact. PRI works with its international network of signatories to put the 6 principles for responsible investment into practice. I've outlined in this slide the 6 principles that I'm referring to. And these 6 principles are voluntary and aspirational set of investment principles that offer a menu of possible actions for incorporating ESG issues into investment and ownership decisions. The principles were developed by investors for investors. In implementing them, signatories contribute to developing a more sustainable global financial system. They have attracted a global signatory base representing a majority of the world's professionally managed investments. So how did PRI start? It actually began all the way back in 2005 when the United Nations Secretary General Kofi Annan invited a group of the world's largest institutional investors to join a process to develop the principles for responsible investment. The principles were subsequently launched in April 2006 at the New York Stock Exchange. And since then, the number of signatories has grown from 100 to over 3,000. To date, in Malaysia, there are only 9 United Nations PRI signatories, of which 3 are asset owners and the remaining 6 are investment managers. While we can be proud to claim the lead as the second highest UN PRI signatories behind Singapore, which has 34 signatories, we still have a long way to go in terms of ESG integration in investment and ownership decisions. So as I mentioned earlier, standardization of data is one of the biggest challenges facing the environmental, social, and governance landscape. For this reason, I am proposing an asset owner-led initiative which sets a local standard on SDG contributions in order to bring consistency and comparability to company-level data. In this slide, I've outlined selected asset owners in Malaysia, together with their portfolio size and composition based on the latest available data. The key message I want to deliver here is that these asset owners certainly have the scale and the ability to transform corporate Malaysia through their ownership in domestic equity and fixed income instruments. I will show you in the next few slides a case study related to this. In July 2020, a group of international pension funds worth about $1 trillion in combined assets has created an asset-owned platform powered by artificial intelligence to assess companies against the United Nations sustainability criteria, known as the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs. So this platform is called the Sustainable Development Investments Asset-Owned Platform. It is subscriber-based platform, currently reviews about 8,000 companies against the 17 United Nations sanction standards. So how does it work? First, the SDI AOP Design Authority, which refers to the core group of asset owners, basically the 4 pension funds that funded the platform, would establish and maintain the taxonomy of solutions that contribute to the SDGs and decides on the rules for identifying FDI. Subsequently, their data and software technology partner, which is ANTIS, would translate these rules into an FDI classification, making use of structured and unstructured data. Artificial intelligence and machine learning, combined with human validation, provide scale and continuous improvement to the FDI dataset of some 8,000 companies. Lastly, in relation to distribution, their current partner, Contigo, will be the distributor for this FDI standard. So subscriber will periodically receive company data and reports via secure technical infrastructure. Ladies and gentlemen, the need for climate action has never been more urgent, and finance can play a powerful role in the transition to a sustainable and inclusive global economy. To achieve this transition, the world requires a significant shift in investments that make financial flows consistent with the pathways toward a low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development. There is no one best way to do ESG integration, and there is no silver bullet for ESG integration. But what we know today is that one of the main barriers to ESG integration is a limited understanding of ESG issues and a lack of comparable ESG data. Companies have made some progress in disclosure of ESG data, but advances in quality and comparability of data still have a long way to go. It would be helpful for issuers and investors to agree upon a single ESG reporting standard that could streamline the data collection process and produce more quality data. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Ai Hui. Certainly, I've learned a lot from your comprehensive presentation about private finance. And I do agree that we have to streamline a certain format so that we can achieve the common goal to combat climate change. Now, moving on to our last speaker for today. So, for our last speaker today, we have Ms. Kiran. And Ms. Kiran is a third-year student pursuing a Bachelor of Arts and Social Sciences in Monash University, Malaysia. She joined MYD this year under the Capacity Building Working Group in hopes to cultivate this interest into productive and actionable means. Now, Kiran, the floor is yours.
So, a very good day to everyone who's taken the time out to tune into our presentation. My name's Kiran and I'm the third presenter for this session, representing the Capacity Building Working Group of Malaysian Youth Delegation. I will be pitching on climate finance in the form of youth involvement, more specifically how we can involve youth in adaptation and mitigation efforts through climate finance, examining existing efforts both internationally and locally, as well as what we can derive from these efforts to adapt in a local scale. So, as a short introduction into the topic, climate change is very much a youth-concerned issue. It's clear by now that the current state of affairs for climate change will significantly impact the future belonging to the youth. So, here are some brief statistics on this matter. Climate change potentially represents a major threat to health and socio-economic stability of youth, particularly in developing countries where 80% of young people live. Young people are key actors in climate action, such as raising awareness, running educational programs, promoting sustainable lifestyles, conserving nature, supporting renewable energy, adopting environmentally friendly practices, as well as implementing adaptation and mitigation projects. Youth constitute the majority of the population in many countries and have an increasing strong social and environmental awareness, which has the power to transform our societies towards a low carbon and climate resilient future. Hence, it's especially important to engage this demographic in climate action, as there's no better way to secure their futures than to directly allow them to address their concerns and tackle what's important to them. So here are some statistics on how youths are currently engaging with climate change, courtesy of the UN's Envoy of Youth, who works on empowering youth to engage with world issues. So firstly, close to 500,000 youth around the world have taken action on climate change through small grants programs, otherwise known as SGPs, projects in their homes, schools, and communities. 84% of the surveyed young people agree that they need more information to prevent climate change, and approximately 89% of youth respondents say that young people can make a difference on climate change. So what can the youth do in terms of their involvement in climate finance? So very broadly, we can split this into 4 aspects as highlighted within MYD's very own climate finance training series. So first of all, it starts with education. So with the knowledge of what climate finance is and how it works, there will be more awareness of its application in real life and its challenges, only so to find a solution to overcome it. Next, in order for climate finance to be significantly scaled up, there needs to be a need for sustainable projects, and this can be done through advocacy for greener industries. With enough public support, it may be enough to shift to an eco-friendly and sustainable economy. Also, crowdfunding and peer-to-peer lending should be considered and practiced in financing sustainable projects to empower local communities to prefer greener solutions and at the same time offer opportunities for economic and social development. Lastly, to ensure government and private investors are incentivized to get involved in climate finance, the demand for transparency and accountability is vital in this regard. So clearly there's quite a few ways that the youth can be engaged in climate finance. However, such efforts have thus far been lacking, considering that climate finance can present itself as a rather complicated topic. However, it is also as vital given the role it plays in combating climate change. So we'll be tackling the aforementioned strategies mentioned. So among the efforts mentioned prior are education, which includes fostering dialogue among youth. So an instance of this is the Youth Ecological Forum that was held in St. Petersburg. Not only did it contain discussion on the Paris Agreement, they also had youth attendees come up with climate finance proposals. So among these proposals include that climate finance from public sources, which currently accounts for 38% of all international climate finance, should be significantly scaled up. Next to public funds, climate finance from private sources also needs to be increased through mainstreaming climate change considerations into the financial system. Climate-friendly projects and investments would appear more desirable to entrepreneurs, managers, and stakeholders. To ensure that governments and private investors have an incentive to get involved in climate finance, a national transparency and accountability system should be put in place, which would enable a tracking of climate finance and effective monitoring of the results that it yields. Thereby, the level of trust in climate finance increases and investing in climate-friendly projects becomes more attractive to them. Indirectly, climate finance could also easily be improved by removing all preserved subsidies, which represent subsidies for fossil fuels, energy-intensive industries, and other climate-damaging projects. To scale up climate finance in developing countries and emerging economies, social investment and microfinancing should be considered as strategies to empower the local population to prefer sustainable, climate-friendly solutions and at the same time offer opportunities for economic and social development. Lastly, regulations should be created for governments and companies which demand a specific level of funding for adaptation programs to be guaranteed. The second initiative presented involves advocacy and participation. In 2018, in lieu of the announcement of the impending climate catastrophe by the United Nations, more than 23,000 students from over 300 French higher education institutions signed a manifesto titled Wake Up Call on the Environment, making a pledge to not work for companies that heavily pollute the environment. So this pledge not only aims to place pressure on French companies to adopt sustainable business models, it also aims to raise students and fresh graduates' awareness on the ecological crisis that they are stepping into and encourage the building of a sustainable world. The manifesto also contains advice on sustainable living on a personal scale. So this showcases a unification of the youth towards a common cause. And it's been shown time and time again that the traction of such initiatives can gain, alongside public pressure, can very much make an impact towards corporations, as it is often in their best interest to listen to public demands. Hence, such methods can be taken into consideration when thinking of climate finance solutions that are catered towards empowering youth. Local youth and fresh graduates can similarly pledge to not work for corporations that actively cause harm towards the environment, as well as to avoid investing in these companies in order to showcase their commitment towards climate action. Next up, I would like to highlight the efforts of the Youth Climate Lab, which is a youth-led non-governmental organization. Among the initiatives that they focus on are raising awareness of health co-benefits of short-lived climate pollutants, otherwise known as SLCPs, mitigation among youth, the health impacts of such SLCPs, including things such as black carbon and methane, have particularly detrimental effects on youth and other vulnerable populations, yet they are often least aware of and active in combating them. Hence, Youth Climate Lab sees a need for a more concerted strategy to better raise awareness of these health co-benefits of SLCP mitigation among youth. Youth Climate Lab would like to collaborate with partners to further the youth outreach around SLCPs. Next up, the role of youth in designing and implementing new actions to combat SLCPs is also critical, not only because youth are uniquely vulnerable, but also because they face barriers in converting their ideas into funding and implementation. Hence, the Youth Climate Lab strives to enable new actions to combat climate change through providing information on climate finance resources available to youth entrepreneurs and creating a global climate venture competition, Greenpreneurs, in partnership with the Global Green Growth Institute and Student Energy. Youth Climate Lab also hosts pop-up labs at conferences and campuses to help young people realize their ideas through working with on-site mentors with experience in the non-profit and social venture sectors. Lastly, Youth Climate Lab also provides capacity support to other small island developing states, which will help empower the youth in this country. Now let's move into some local examples of climate finance initiatives. So a local initiative focusing on sustainability that I want to highlight is by Fuse Ecotier, which is a social enterprise focused on conservation projects in Malaysia. In short, it oversees volunteerism projects held by either themselves or other parties, which includes corporations and schools. Hence, Fuse Ecotier is reliant on investments and crowdfunding in order to carry out these programs. Hence, this can be an example of adaptation finance. Among one of these initiatives being their weekly Sungai Kayu Ara cleanup, where they on average pick up 100 kilograms of waste weekly. They are also very involved in engaging youth in universities and through non-governmental organizations. Hence, this can be a method in empowering youth to take action, and it's also something that corporations can look into. Another example of local climate finance efforts is by CIMB Bank, where they introduce their sustainable banking products to showcase their personal commitment towards climate action by supporting solutions, practices, and projects that foster sustainable development. Among their initiatives include their EcoSafe savings account. So out of their total EcoSafe portfolio, CIMB Islamic contributes 0.2% to green activities such as conservation initiatives and education programs that help protect the environment and sustain its natural resources for both current and future generations. As the allocation grows, more green projects would be funded. Hence, the opening of such EcoSafe accounts will allow individuals to indirectly help the environment. Next up, there are also preferential rates for green buildings and hybrid cars, where the purchase of these efficient products can yield discounts for their consumers. Next, environmental, social, and governance investment, otherwise known as ESG investment, which uses the latest robotic technology to generate a strong investment performance potential with optimal risk management. And initiatives for businesses include renewable energy financing, sustainability bonds, sustainability loans, as well as green financing. Now we'll move on into miscellaneous youth involvement. Among them is the Conference of Youth, otherwise known as COI, which is held annually on the weekend prior to the start of the year-end United Nations Climate Change Conference, which aims to bring young people from around the world together to build the capacity of these international youth climate movements, share skills, and collaborate on campaigns and strategies related to the UNFCCC process, as well as enhancing youth participation in the UNFCCC process. on this regard, the UNFCCC Secretariat works together with youth organizations and United Nations agencies to create opportunities for young people to participate in United Nations climate change conferences. So this includes events such as Young and Future Generations Day, Intergeneration Inquiry, high-level briefings for youth, UN Youth Booths, virtual participation rooms, as well as funding youth participants from developing countries. So since 2009, funding from the governments of Norway and the Netherlands has allowed young people from the Global South to travel to the United Nations climate change conferences. This helps build the capacity of the international youth climate change movements and increases the impact that the youth have at climate change negotiations. So lastly, climate change youth organizations are one of the best platforms to elevate and empower youth to have their voices be heard. So in efforts of integrating climate finance into youth involvement, this is a high priority that can be looked into, as oftentimes they lack the platform for their ideas to be heard, and such organizations are a viable method of granting them the means to do so. Some examples of this are School Strike for Climate, something which everyone is probably very familiar with, otherwise known as Fridays for Future, which is founded by Greta Thunberg herself, where students, they go on strike on Fridays to demand that climate action be taken by their political leaders. There's also the Sunrise Movement, which is an American youth-led political movement that's coordinated by a political action organization called Sunrise that advocates for political action on climate change in America. There's also the Youth Climate Movement, an international network of youth organizations that empower young people to take positive action on climate change. And of course, the Malaysian Youth Delegation, which is ourselves. Hence, it's vital that these organizations exist in order to educate and empower the youth, as well as allow them to introduce and commit to actionable means of combating climate change. In conclusion, these are all methods that can be carried out by the youth that are related to climate finance and can be taken as examples for initiatives that can be taken in a local scale. Youth can play a very meaningful and vital part of bringing climate action to life, and it's important to look into involving them with climate finance. That's all for my presentation. Thank you for your time, and I hope this has been a meaningful presentation for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Kieran, for the comprehensive presentation. As a youth myself, I believe we are too part of the solution. And with that, that concludes our presentation session. Okay, thank you so much for listening to our pitch today. Now, moving on, we shall move on to our Q&A. So without further ado, I'll start off with the first question. So I guess this is open to the entire panel. Do you see a large movement of youth in Malaysia really invested in time and support for climate change issues and topics? Any takers?
I think I can start us off. So in my opinion, there's definitely potential for Malaysian youth to get more invested and more supportive towards climate change and climate issues. I mean, speaking in a more general sense, we've definitely seen young people becoming more driven towards climate issues, and as more awareness spreads and we become more aware towards just how severe the climate situation can be. So things like Fridays for Climate, for instance, we can definitely see like very large amounts of youth engagement, and it's definitely a testament to how much we can get engaged towards climate issues. In terms of Malaysia, there's definitely room for improvement. I think that definitely there's a lot more space for youth to start gaining awareness on how important being invested in these issues are, as well as getting kickstarted on how exactly to engage with these issues. Does anyone else want to take it?
Thank you, Kieran.
Yeah,
Thanks,
sorry.
Brian.
Yeah, I can say that I think there's a large movement of youth in Malaysia that are invested in time and support when it comes to climate change issues. For starters, we have MYD. We are a coalition of youth from different backgrounds and experiences, trying to address, how should I say, we try to digest complex issues of climate change and trying to distill it to make it understandable and attractive almost to the wider public. And also there's another group called KAMI, I think Climate Action Malaysia. They are more of grassroots climate justice youth-led coalition, and it shows that there are variations of climate advocacy appetites in Malaysia. So I think that's a good indication of youth involvement in Malaysia when it comes to climate issues.
If I may share my views as well. So I felt that unlike other countries, perhaps the movement of youth in Malaysia didn't get as much coverage. Like normally common you see in news article, they talk about how like youth school goers organize strikes, like refusing to attend school. We don't really see that in Malaysia, and I'm not encouraging, that students should start behaving in that manner. But what I'm trying to say is that there are various climate actions that youth has undertaken by volunteering in like NGOs, civil societies, doing some cleanup in rivers, in beaches, in waterfalls. I felt that more attention should be highlighted to activities like this. And there's definitely a lot more room improvement for youth to engage more for climate action, as well as perhaps to incorporate more education formally in our curriculum about climate change.
Okay, thank you so much everyone for your very interesting discussion and comprehensive answers. I think definitely as you to myself, I feel like we do have a part to play in this, and definitely there's a lot of room for improvement. So I highly encourage any youth or perhaps anyone that's on this conference to participate, get out there and get involved. Now moving on to the next question. I think this is also a general question. So, do you think climate finance is highly politically driven? If yes, what are the viable options to tackle that issue? If not, why? Any takers?
I think climate finance can be political. I think if not on the issue itself, maybe on the tools. So for example, for example, like let's say if you want to introduce carbon tax, the word tax is a very reactive word, I guess I would say, depending on your stance on things, because I think carbon tax can be beneficial can be one beneficial climate finance tool. For example, you can tax companies that are high emitters. You can charge them, I think, per ton of CO2 that they emit. And from the tax revenue, you can give those dividends to the communities that are mostly affected, or let's say companies who take resources from a specific community, those dividends can be given to the communities that they have taken those resources from, if that makes sense.
Anyone else would like to add on?
Yeah, so I think not just climate finance, definitely climate change as a whole is very politically driven. Like if we want to take the United States as an example, like we've seen that the Trump administration, they've pulled back on like coal limitations and withdrawn the US from the Paris Agreement. So these things are obviously, they're quite harmful to the environment as well as the climate change movement as a whole. So definitely a lot of the implementations that surround climate change issues also they center around policies that have to be implemented on federal levels in order to make a substantive change. That's why I think it's rather important that to draw it back to the youth topic, it's important for youth and policymakers to be able to engage with one another. It has to be like a mutual sort of engagement so that we can elevate specifically what's important towards climate change to the people who can do substantive change about it.
Thank you, Kiran. If I may interject for a short announcement. So to everyone that's on the conference, our polling session has started. So while we do the polling, we'll be still answering your questions. So please remember to scan the QR code for the polling session. So basically the polling section works in a way that you should pick your favorite pitch, the pitch that you think is the best solution in the Malaysian context. So by the end of our session, we'll be announcing the winners. So cast your votes. Valerie, would you like to add on to the question, or shall we move on to the next question?
I think we can move on to the next question.
Okay, sure.
Excuse me, can I add on something? I just realized something.
Definitely, go ahead.
Okay, I think like when it comes to climate change, whether it can be political or not, I think if we look at the past in terms of, in terms of severity, I think we can compare it to the financial crisis of 2008. I'm not saying that they're both the same, but I think in terms of how, as a collective, a government actually addresses it. So I think, I'm not mistaken, a lot of the countries during that time, they took a whatever it takes mentality or approach to reflate their economy, sort of to pump in money to reflate their economy, basically. So I think in terms of climate finance, if they're saying, I think what they like to say is where we're going to get the money. The thing is, we can get the money because we have done it in the past. So I think if we as a collective choose to take climate change as a shared global problem, and so I think that will be, the first step in implementing and practicing climate finance in a wider scale. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Farhana. Now we shall move on to the third question. So this is, I guess, more directed to Kiran since you spoke about the youth participation, but the other panels, please feel free to add on. The question goes, what advice would you give to youths who are keen to align their finances towards green?
Thank you. I think definitely do your research towards, say, what companies that you engage in. So to check on, say, what companies engage with practices that could be more harmful towards the environment, or what companies that, say, have CSR towards environment movements. So I think there's definitely a lot of resources out there that can tell you what to do. Are there any other speakers who would like to add on?
If I may share my views, so I guess putting myself in the shoes of a youth, where perhaps you would need savings account. I'm thinking in terms of what financial services you may need, like a savings account perhaps. And in this case, you could look for savings account that have green features to them. What do I mean by that is like perhaps they mentioned that any deposit within the account will only be used for green lending purposes. So in a sense, that will align your saving habits towards greener aspects. And what other things you may need towards your life, perhaps like when eventually you decided to make the life purchases, big decisions like buying a car, buying a house, you can go for like green housing loan, green car purchase loans. So there are a lot of things that you can customize towards the green habits that you decide to embrace in your life. You just have to, like what Kira mentioned, have to do your homework. A lot of things are out there in Google, in the internet, ask your friends. All the best for your green financing journey.
Thanks, Valerie. Okay, so I'll just move on to the next question. How do you empower youth in getting involved in climate and sustainable goals when there are more critical issues to be discussed, such as normal wage and education inequality? So, any takers? This is a very interesting question. I think it's something that should be heavily discussed. Anyone would like to go first?
I think I can go first. So I think using like the phrase, or using the word critical rather, it's a bit complicated because I think a lot of these social kind of issues, they cannot be particularly weighed against one another in such a manner. Like definitely issues like normal wage and education inequality is important. Like that can't be denied. And at the same time, I think these issues, they can also be tied into climate change as well, like a sort of intersectionality between these issues, if I'm using the word correctly. So like education inequality, for instance, it can lead to a lack of climate change awareness. And for things like wage, there's definitely a lot of instances of people being exploited in like work environments such as sweatshops, because sweatshops are just cheaper to maintain, and it produces like products that are more harmful towards the environment. So I think in this sense, we can definitely put like an equal amount of importance towards all of these issues. Like we don't have to weigh climate change above one or the other issue. So yeah, that's my 2 cents.
Anyone would like to add on to Kiran's answer?
Well, from my point of view, I do agree with Kiran in a sense that um, at this age, it's hard to decouple, climate and sustainable goals from economic development. In fact, I felt that youth should embrace that because that will be the new normal going forward, and they could see it as a factor to be more innovative in the way they approach work, in the way they approach, creativity. Um, it is not a matter of prioritization because these elements of sustainability of climate change is embedded within education, within your work, whether it's white collar or blue collar. There is a lot of innovation that you can embark on along the value chain of whatever work you do. So I felt that you should be more creative in terms of thinking how they could um, innovate and embrace these sustainability elements into their daily whatever they do on a daily basis.
Thank you, Valerie. Definitely, I feel like that's correct. That climate is climate. I mean, it's not a standalone event that we cannot take it out of it and say that we should prioritize a certain issue over the other. So both of you have gave very valid inputs. Farhana, would you like to add on to their answers?
This is just from my experience. But I do agree with what Valerie and what Kieran said, which is that you can't really rank these issues on level of importance because they're all important. From my experience, I had a friend who lived, I think, considered like in a rural, and she was living in a rural area, and she was considered below the poverty line. And I can definitely say that from her perspective, sustainability wasn't the most important issue at the time. It was more about making sure that her family was being fed and they had enough money to last for the month. So I think I think on an individual level, I think if you still want to address this sustainability issue, I think you just have to do the best you can at the rate that you can. And that goes back to what we talked about before, like how do youth get involved in addressing the climate issue? So it comes with education and asking questions and also realizing for yourself what is your climate advocacy appetite, or also realizing what resources you have immediately in front of you that you can use, because maybe some people all they have is a phone and the internet, and maybe that's all that they can do, and that should be good enough. And inspire to do more, obviously.
Thanks, Farhana. I guess this brings us back to the UNFCCC principle of common but differentiated capacities, and that is basically what all the countries in the world are doing. We're acting with a common goal to how climate change impacts, but with our differentiated capacities as well as our responsibilities. So I guess we just have to act based on our own capacities and not, kind of like not overexert ourselves, but just try our best. So moving on to the next question. Okay, do you think that having an irreversible climate change clock encourages corporate complacency instead of taking immediate action?
Hmm.
Does anyone have any input towards this question?
Hmm.
Very small input from me, I guess, because I think, I mean, if I'm being optimistic, I want to say there's no action, but we've definitely seen like a lack of it despite the growing urgency. But I mean, I definitely think there has been an increase, but definitely more can be done for the matter.
From my point of view, I guess it all boils down to the purpose of the corporate. So if they are more profit driven, then they may say that, to be honest, they are just producing their products and services based on the current market demand. So usually you hear them discussing about how like currently consumers are not willing to pay higher price for perhaps more greener products. And so where can you create this demand? It's perhaps, I would say, it requires not only the corporates, it requires consumer as well, hand in hand, to demand that they want a greener product. And if the corporates are unwilling to produce or to meet such a demand, then consumers have the consumer power to choose where they want to source their services and products from. So I would like to rephrase the question to perhaps thinking the stakeholders in a more wider scope rather than just corporates alone.
All right, so due to time constraint, we will take one last question and then we'll kind of wrap up the session because we only have 10 more minutes. So this is our last question. So our Prime Minister talks about a green recovery approach for the budget 2021. So do you think the pandemic is an opportunity for climate finance or an excuse to steer towards aggressive consumer spending, which will likely be detrimental to the environment to encourage economic recovery? This is a very pressing and very current issue. So anyone would like to take up the challenge?
If I may, I think my answer can sort of relate to the previous question as well. I think now can be a great time for us to implement climate finance at a government scale, even at a wide scale. But at the same time, I think we have to also be realistic that majority of our economy and our industries are dependent on a more traditional way of doing things. So a lot of it is reliance on oil and gas. And I think in order for us to want to transition to a green economy, it does take a step-by-step approach, because maybe as a whole, we don't have the proper infrastructure to support a green economy yet. So I think having the discussion now and taking the initiative now is better than nothing. But we also have to be very realistic of what we're dealing with currently. And we also have to be very committed to the goal of having a green economy.
Thank you, Farhana. Okay, so I guess this basically marks the end of our Q&A session. So there are a few questions that we're not able to address, unfortunately. But if the speakers are willing, we would actually address it via email. So I guess if the speakers would like to take up the questions, it is accessible for them. So now we will move on to wrapping up the session. So just before naming the winner, I'd just like to remind everyone that all the solutions that we discussed today are viable depending on the situation. So some of the solutions may perform better than others in different circumstances. So it may be an ideal solution for Malaysia, but something might be better for a different country. So all the solutions that we discussed today are perfectly valid, but it depends on the circumstances. So without further ado, I shall check the poll one last time, refresh the page and see. All right, so let's give our hand to Valerie Chu Ai Hui for being the winner of our pitch today. Congratulations. Okay. Okay, so that basically concludes our session today. Thank you so much for staying with us. So before you go, I would just like to remind all of you to give us feedback. So there will be a feedback form link that will be displayed on the screen. So please do submit your feedback so that we can further improve our future sessions. And just one small shout out that all four of us are part of a part of the Malaysian youth delegation, and we are committed to bring movement in the climate scene. So to follow our movement, to follow our progress, we would highly encourage everyone to follow us on MYD Climate, MYDCLIMAT on Twitter and Instagram to keep up with our progress. And we'll also be having our local conference of youth in late November. So this is just a small shout out to kind of promote our event in late November and early December to make youth voices heard and to connect youth with each other as well as experts. So the date for the Malaysian ALCOI, the Malaysian Local Conference of Youth 2020 will be 28th to 29th November, 5th to 6th December, 12th to 13th December. And this year, Malaysians ALCOI will expand its focus beyond policy and national solutions. So this includes exciting topics at the regional Southeast Asian level, such as energy transition, youth climate leadership, and nature-based solutions. So please register interest with us now and make sure you get the news to sign up. So I highly encourage, if you're someone that's very new to the climate scene or is interested to get to know more, please follow us on Twitter and Instagram. And this marks the end of our session. So once again, I thank you so much for staying with us tonight. Thank you so much for allowing me to be your moderator. Thank you so much for spending time with our panelists today. And last but not least, thank you for iGEM for making this possible. Good night, everyone.